Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Agile Coaching Exchange here in March 2024. Our guest tonight is Nigel Baker, the esteemed Nigel Baker. Nigel is one of the first Agile coaches and first people involved in Scrum in the UK. He has an extensive experience and career, originally as a software engineer and working in all sorts of organizations, making agility happen and helping people adapt to the changing, crazy, more complicated world. If you're ever at a Scrum gathering, Nigel is a great person to sit with over a cocktail and a generally all-round good guy in our community. So we're really, really pleased to have him back. Please give a very, very warm welcome to Nigel Baker.
Hello. I've just seen a face so from the past. It's literally 20 years. Hello, Greg, out there today. Um, it's not quite 20 years, Greg, but it nearly is. Um, welcome to what the hell am I going to talk about? So I was just writing a slide a minute ago for you all. I was just doing some slides just before you turned up. Well, strictly speaking, I was doing a slide before you turned up. And this was a slide I was designing. Here we go. Changing, failing, scaling. AKA the only new slide in this entire presentation. So what I've done with this presentation is I've gathered together a wealth of material, okay, on basically my experiences over the last basically a year, um, creating, building, developing, and teaching new ways of scaling via the Scrum Alliance. Okay, now, see what's out there. There we go. How are we dealing with questions? I hate all questions, Mike. You sit there in silence and nod. No, we'll do Q&A at the end. Q&A at the end. So if there's something incredibly controversial I say, just be warned, I probably didn't mean it. I have been known to be sarcastic. So if it sounds very controversial, I may be like a comedian. I may not be what I mean. I may mean the exact opposite of that. But yeah, we're doing Q&A at the end. Okay. Now, yes, so just a bit about me, because I thought, frankly, I don't think Ben did a good enough job introducing me, so I'll introduce myself. I've been I started off programming from a small child. So literally, my father owned a computer before I was born in the mid-70s, growing up around computers my entire life. I've been in IT nearly 30 years now, which frankly is interesting. And as Ben said, I was one of the first people using Scrum in the UK in British Telecom, where I work with Greg, who's on this call and just put himself on the screen off. He's terrified of being called out twice in one session. Uh, we're doing Agile 22 years now. About 19 years as an Agile coach, been a certified trainer since 2007. What else have I done? Spoken at conferences, annoyed people. I've been around a long time doing this stuff. I started off in British Telecom, as we said. That was interesting. And I seem to have been stuck with the moniker of big tech. So my entire agile coaching career has, not all of it, but pretty much most of it has been big technology companies, sometimes with big legacy systems, definitely not small, quick startups. There's been a few, but it's by far been the big, heavy lumps, right? And before we get going with this presentation on scaling, I do want to give a bit of context. Okay, context that I think context is king. If you've seen one of my presentations before, you'll know I actually did a presentation once called Context is King, about context being everything. And what I want to do is give you a little background on this scaling stuff we've been doing, and why it exists, because I'm not sure a lot of people do. I'm not sure people do. And it's a bit of a journey back in time. So basically, a bit of the history of the Scrum Alliance. Now, most of you know the Scrum Alliance was one of the biggest, largest non-profit agile organizations out there, with, depending on how you measure membership, over 1 million members, been going since about 2001, right? Different from a lot of other large agile organizations out there in the certification space, where most of them are actually for-profit companies. So owned by certain people with shareholders and dividends. The Scrum Alliance is not that. I don't know if any of you know this, but it was actually founded as an offshoot of the Agile Alliance many years ago. So when the Agile Alliance was formed after the Agile Manifesto was written, the Scrum Alliance was originally started off as a project investigating doing basically certified Agile training. And at the time, the story goes that a lot of the Agile founders were not particularly interested in certification, didn't believe in it, and some were very focused on the idea of certification. And so the Scrum Alliance was an offshoot of that, focusing on that certification side, founded by Ken Schwaber, Mike Cohen, Esther Darby. Now, basically built around this one product, Certified Scrum Master, pretty much was. So for large portions of its life, the Scrum Alliance had one training product, which was Certified Scrum Master, which every human being on earth did. Everyone who did anything in Agile did that certification. Okay. Now, in 2009, Schwaber left the Scrum Alliance, or was asked to leave the Scrum Alliance, depends on who you speak to, for reasons, of which I will not go on to in a recorded Zoom call. I will not, but I will say I just got a reply from Ken Schwaber, 30 minutes ago. Sent me an email, which is quite nice of him. Now, but what's interesting about this, and I think this sets the tone of the entire piece, is that a lot of those other agile organizations are still what I call very much guru-led. What that means is like a big figure leads the organization and sets the tone. Sometimes the actual owner, but often like so if you're with the Safe, it's Dean Leffingwell. If you're doing sort of Scrum Inc., it's Jeff Sutherland. If you know these big figures sort of setting the direction. The Scrum Alliance is not like that. The Scrum Alliance is very much a community-based organization, and that has pros and that has cons. So you can see how down here you see a list of anyone know. Okay, some of you abroad may not know this, but can anyone tell me quickly who are the 6 people down the bottom and what connects them?
Well, they're all prime ministers. I don't. Was it Healy? I'm not sure the one on the left.
Oh, okay, yeah, harsh, isn't it? So, can you remember the one on the far left? Anyone want to go for the one on the far left?
James Callaghan.
Jim Callaghan.
Yeah.
He like Doctor Who regenerated into. And that's not how prime ministers work, but it should be how they work. Margaret Thatcher. Then we went off into John Major, then Tony Blair, then Gordon Brown, then Cameron, and then the universe exploded, and we don't like to talk about it anymore. But before the global apocalypse, come back a little bit. The reason I show you this picture is I spotted this pattern years ago, which is every time the UK had a prime minister, once that prime minister fell out of power, they often cast the person next as almost the exact opposite of the previous person. So Jim Callaghan was like a conciliator. He was a working with the unions, you know, someone who had beer and sandwiches in number 10 to persuade people. And when he was dropped, they had, whether you liked her or hate her, a single visionary leader, Thatcher. Then Thatcher met her demise. And who did the Conservatives pick? John Major. Someone who does deals, someone who gets people in rooms, someone conciliatory, someone facilitatory, right? Then when that fell, Tony Blair, vision person. I have a dream. Crime and the causes of crime. Then when he fell, we get Gordon Brown, again, someone who works the groups and not a public speaker by any stretch of the imagination, someone who works the... And then we got Cameron, who does the Blair. So you see how it's like each one's almost the counterpoint to the other? That's basically how Scrum Alliance CEOs have worked over the last 20 years since Ken left. Each CEO of the Scrum Alliance has kind of been a counterpoint to the previous one. So sometimes we would have CEOs who would get stuff done. They're doers. They move. They smash things. But sometimes they didn't get the you know what the trouble with visionary people is? Sometimes the vision doesn't line up with what the people want, and you can't take them with you, and things don't work. So then the alliance casts someone who knows the people, someone who works the community, someone who buys the drinks at the gathering, someone who, you know, is warm and comforting and really good, but they don't have a vision. And the alliance doesn't go very far. So they're gone. And the alliance casts someone with it. So it keeps going in circles. And I think at this moment, I feel we are in a visionary CEO, not a conciliatory CEO. So if I had to describe the new CEO, Tristan, I'd say he's moving fast and making things, is what I would describe him as. Moving fast and making things. So expanding up what the Scrum Alliance does, trying to improve the website, trying to, you know, really shake up the Scrum Alliance and get it into a state where it's fit for purpose in the modern world. So where does that take us? Well, one of the big gaps in what the Scrum Alliance has been doing for years, right? For years, is Scaling. Now, some of you on this call, I know for a fact, have got some of the scars from these previous conversations. But the Scrum Alliance in the past has joined up in formal or semi-informal ways with a variety of different scaling approaches. Whether it was right back in the day, it was SAFe when SAFe was first launched, by the way. The Scrum Alliance and SAFe had a bit of alignment where the idea was, hey, SAFe does the scaling, Scrum Alliance does the team stuff. That didn't last long. Then along comes Less, and Rickard here can talk about Less later, but not now, Rickard, but later. And then finally, the Scrum at Scale joint venture with Jeff Sutherland, which I'm again not going to get into because of politics, but collapsed into court cases and big amounts of money being paid. And so, with all this in mind, with the rubble left behind of these experiences, the Scrum Alliance is starting to look to basically build some form of scaling product. Now, I hear what you're thinking. I can hear what you're saying. Have you ever seen this XKCD cartoon before? You know, there are 14 competing standards. Ridiculous. What we need is one universal standard to cover all those use cases. Yeah. Situation, we now have 15 competing standards. And so one of the key ideas behind this was, this is not going to be another framework. This course cannot be another offering like all the others. Hey, here's a new one. We'll call it Bob or something. It's a new frame. It's a new method. It's got to be something neutral on that topic, right? And so, okay, great. So this idea of an agnostic product, a product that doesn't like get involved in framework wars, I think is a good idea. But why do we need it? Why now? Surely you think it's a bit late now. Like, well, why? What does the world of work look like in Agile in 2024? See, up till recently, Agile has got quite what I would call Baroque, which I mean is like very, a lot of fluff associated with it, a lot of gadgets and gizmos and gimmicks and canvases, and everyone's done a canvas over the last few years, and we've got this whole welter of extraneous material in the Agile space. And when the economy and the world has started tightening up, I think people have looked at Agile as being a little bit extraneous, a little bit, bells and whistles. Oh, you coaches, what do I need a coach for? We've got to pay our bills. I need people who get stuff done. You coaches just... And to be fair, they may have a point. Because if you look at Agile in 2024, for a lot of people, it looks like this, like the scaled Agile framework. Some huge, heavy process with lots of jargon, lots of methods piled on methods, lots of job roles piled on job roles, powered by some software tool like Jira. Now, I'm not going to ask you how you feel about Jira. I'm not going to ask. I am going to ask. How do you feel about Jira? Don't tell me, or just give me stress. But very heavy tooling these days, Jira is. Heavy tools, heavy frames, heavy models, right? I think giving us the appearance of being heavy and wasteful, right? And that concerns me. Now, this is interesting because actually the Scrum Alliance seems to be hugely influenced by this report by the Scrum Alliance and the Business Agility Institute put together, Skills in the New World of Work, which you can download from the Scrum Alliance website if you want to. It's a very interesting report, right? But there's 4 phrases I picked out of the first page of that report, which is, they say Agile as one. Yay! We're moving from early adopters to late majority. Yay! Agile has been commoditized. And for organizations, this means more options and greater opportunities, but Agile needs to be part of your DNA. And so I'm seeing sort of 2 different messages here. People are saying Agile's one, but one what? And secondly, a lot of organizations I'm seeing have their Agile got very large and fragile and low value. And so they've been cutting away at the roles, at the peoples. And that's not good. That's a real scary thing. And so, I don't know if some of you here will know where this quote comes from. From Alistair Coburn, I'm interested in fending off the fat methodology armory, the vast quantity of RUP, Anderson, SEI, etc. salespeople, putting ideas into CIOs' minds. They should have lots of paperwork to be safe. Countering, I want a turnkey methodology, one that works straight out of the boss mentality. These are two battles I could use help with. Because I think Alistair's lining up with me here. He seems to me there's a fear of commoditization in that language as well. The idea you just buy something and install it from out the box. Does anyone know when Alistair said this, by the way? Does anyone know when he said this quote?
Must be a long time ago if it's Anderson.
Yeah, giving it away. It's basically, this is actually from the wiki they set up to organize the Lightweight Methods Conference that became the meeting that created the Agile Manifesto. So this is one of Alistair's aims in basically 2000 to say, look, we need to deal with heavyweight methods that turn your brain off, basically. And it's coming back, and it's coming back in a big way. As famous George said it, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Right? And my fear is a lot of what we have today, I am feeling like we're back in 2000 again, except with just agile jargon on it. So this is why I personally really wanted to get involved when the Scrum Alliance in May 2023 said, hey, we're looking to build a new scaling product. We would like volunteers to help us. And a lot of people volunteered to help. There was a huge amount of people saying, yo, me, pick me. And I volunteered as well. And then basically there was a lot of filtering. So lots of people got ruled out for a variety of reasons that the Scrum Alliance can talk about, variety of reasons of why they felt they weren't appropriate. But somehow I made it through the net, along with Simon, who I can see down here. Simon made it through the net as well. Ask him how he did it. I heard it was large amounts of Canadian dollars, but that's just a rumor. That's just a rumor. But the point is, a few of us made it through this process. Now, we were asked to basically be subject matter experts. Okay, you're subject matter experts. What should this course be all about? Now, as a person with lots of thoughts on lots of things, I had already done quite a bit of work on this topic in my own head. And so what I did was I put down basically a slide pack I put together for the Scrum Alliance and for the other SMEs of my feelings on a variety of topics. And now I would love to say I put it down because I wanted to communicate with them, and of course I did. And I put it down because I want to share it with them, of course I did. But also I wanted to make, and this is just the cynical Nigel in me, I wanted to make clear I had these ideas before the process, so any NDA wouldn't apply to these ideas, basically, because we were non-disclosure agreement on this work. So I can't tell you about how the sausage is made too much. But don't worry, there's no secrets there. It's just part of the, I would say, is the process the Scrum Alliance follows, which is kind of cool to get to some results. But I did have some thoughts beforehand, which is this. Everyone talks about scaling, but what the hell do they mean? You need to define your terms, right? Because for a lot of people, they're using these two terms interchangeably. Scaling means big, or scaling means lots, or scaling means both. And I think we should be careful here, because the idea of scaled approaches is really about big product development, not necessarily enterprise product development. They're two different animals. You know, I work in a big company is different to I build big products. They're two different animals. And so I came up with this diagram here saying, look, we need to discuss before we get going with this, what level we're working at. So are we actually going to be trying to cover what they call business agility? You know, hey, agile in your coffee shop. Are we covering like enterprise agility, agile HR? You know, are we trying to do big product Scrum or big product agile, lots of teams working together? Like, what are we actually trying to spec here? We need to discuss that, right? And secondly, my other big issue was the Scrum Alliance classically works on a model that is different to many of the other certification bodies. So there's a range of bodies out there. Some of them are very prescriptive in their materials. So the idea is you have to teach the materials the body gives you. So you have a slide pack and you must teach that slide pack. And some of you here have been on courses. If I know some of the faces, I know the courses you've been on, where literally the trainer's been clicking through 200 slides saying, look, I don't agree with this, but I have to show it. Like, click, 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 which is not helpful. The Scrum Alliance doesn't do that. Scrum Alliance sets learning objectives. Okay, what are the outcomes we're expected to achieve? That's what the Scrum line says. And then us as trainers have to build material to achieve that outcomes, which gives it a lot of flexibility and gives it variety, trainer to trainer, coach to coach. Cool, huh? Well, the trouble is sometimes that's like them giving you a footprint and you have to kind of work out what the foot is to fit the footprint. And that can eat up a lot of time and effort. So when we started discussing this, I was saying, look, if we are going to create a footprint, we probably need to give the people who are going to teach and use this course some idea of what it is makes those outcomes. Okay, so what's the vision behind this product? Who's this product aimed at? What problem are we trying to solve with this product? What's the business model behind the product? How can we actually make it work? And so one of my big things was, I think we need to think about this product development like it's real product development. And we did. I can tell you now, I can't go into the details of it because, again, it's internal. But I felt we used some very powerful, proper product techniques to elicit results and to get thinking about what this product is and thinking about who the audience is. Treating it like a real product development, not just a collection of slides. Because it all comes down to this, right? If you're going to make any product sell, it's got to hit the three things, hasn't it? Feasibility, desirability, viability. A product has to be desirable by a customer. The customer needs to want it. It has to be actually viable to sell it in some way. And it has to be feasible to create and feasible to build the actual product. And so we need to keep this in mind. My issue with a lot of products in the Agile space at the moment is that some of them are viable, but not desirable. Some are desirable, but not feasible. Some are just horrible and that's why they're not selling. It's why you see, have you seen at the moment the proliferation of certifications online? These thousands of Agile certifications we see, everyone inventing their own certification in-house, and they all seem to lack some basic fundamental productization. Actually, does someone want to buy this? Does someone want to sell it? And can you buy it and sell it? Now, this is where we need to quote Isaac Newton. If I've seen further, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. And so, luckily or unluckily, before all this work happened, I spent my entire life being very nerdy about scaling approaches. And so I did say there are certain approaches we need to pay attention to. Oh boy, there's lots of approaches out there. We could play scaling approach bingo if you wanted to. So, okay, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 approaches listed on this slide. Please, in the chat box, tell me how many you have heard of those 14 before today. Please, now, in the chat box, tell me now how many of you heard of before today. There's 14 on that list. There's 14 on that list. How many of you heard of today? Type it in the chat box now. Don't be ashamed. Don't be ashamed. I'll tell you now, I've made up one of them. One of them's fake. It's completely made up. It's not, doesn't exist. Keep voting, keep voting. It doesn't matter how many you know. Don't be shy, don't be shy. 6, 5, 7, 6, 4, 9. Like that. It's there we go, 6. But I'll now reveal to you, none of them are made up. I made up that lie I just made up. They all exist somewhere, somehow, in some way. But there's a range of approaches out there. And as I started working my way through these approaches, I started spotting something really interesting that I felt was interesting, which is there is some unspoken themes to these approaches that I don't think anyone's really explicitly spelt out. They've called them all, hey, these scaling frameworks you can buy, but no one's actually, up till now, has really spotted that different approaches seem to have different thematic ways around it or approaches to it. So I came up with this. Right? I came up with this. Now, again, this is all models are wrong. All models are wrong, but some are useful. What I tried to do is do one of those classic 2x2 consultant grids, right? But looking at it from a practice and a power point of view. So some approaches are very prescriptive. You must do this like this. Some approaches are very principle-based. Hey, what's a practice? Let's hold hands and talk about collaboration. Some approaches are very empowered. It's up to you, developer. You set the tone. And some of the processes are very managed. It's up to me, CEO. I have decided what you're going to do. And what I tried to do was, as best for my own personal experience, was map some of the major approaches out there onto this graph. Because my worry is, if you try and stand for everything, like framework agnostic, you could stand for nothing. Like you could have no opinions at all trying to cover all these different approaches. So in terms of these 4 boxes, the one you've probably seen most often, the most popular method, of course, is SAFe, right? Which is very prescriptive and very managed. So very recipe led if you're not careful. The idea of, again, we've got to be careful. Don't badmouth anything. I'm doing safe work at the moment, but it can be very, 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 very turn your brain off and follow the approach. Turn your brain off and follow the approach. You know, and now that can be darkly attractive to people. When we talked about desirability earlier on, if you tell me, here's the instructions, just follow the instructions, trust the process, you don't have to think, just follow the process and you'll be fine. That can be very attractive to a lot of people in work. Very attractive. I haven't got to do the heavy lifting intellectually. I haven't got to do the heavy pain. I just need to, you know, just do what the book says and we will be agile. Now, so it does reduce fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So it can be attractive. But the problem is, almost certainly in the type of work we do, well, as H.L. Mencken said, for every complex problem, there's a solution that's simple, neat, and wrong. Taking this heavy method approach could be rather deadly, Now, okay, there's a joke supposedly by Voltaire. Now, I don't think Voltaire said this, but this agglomeration, which was called and which is still calls itself the Holy Roman Empire, was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. So famously, I don't know if you know this, but the Scaled Agile framework is not a framework. If you've done any of the, you know, it's actually, they call it themselves a knowledge base. It's a knowledge base that you draw from. And so this treating it like a framework's a bit deadly anyway. You're supposed to treat it like a knowledge base that you draw information from, not as a holistic solution that you follow slavishly. And so just remember, again, for those of us who are safe, you're now thinking, but I know that, Nigel. I tell people that. You just remember, you know, there's this one. Just to be cheeky, you know, when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. So if something keeps coming out being treated like a framework and used like a framework, it probably is a framework. But there are other ways to approach these things. So Ben and I were chatting just before this thing started about this approach called ELSE, which has been created by a few Scrum trainers from the Scrum Alliance, a principle-led approach. So the idea being that because there's no one size fits all, because there's no recipes you can follow, instead you guide yourself with principles that guide your approach and evolve your approach, which I think sounds probably correct, right? Probably sort of the right way to do stuff. Okay, so being principle led, but the trouble is the misuse of that could be high. Because if you're doing something very high level, you've got to have a lot of skill to derive from first principles actions and behaviors. And so my worry is it could be intellectually correct, but just very hard to actually be used by real people in real work. And also, I've got it's a small issue. I'm a bit scared about principle-led models in general, because it's like, that's getting in here now, not in here. Like, my worry is a little bit that it could be a bit thought crimey. Hey, comrade, you're not showing enough collaboration. And you know what I mean? I get a bit worried with that. I think practices are something you can enforce in work. Like, you follow processes so you don't steal from the burger van, you don't rob the patients or something. You got these things. But I have a concern when you start saying things like, you must all follow these sorts of principles. Because I can just imagine situations where collaboration is not the correct thing to do. You know, a burglar's breaking in your house. You don't collaborate with them, do you? Hey, let me help you through the window. Look, this is why I keep the expensive stuff. Now, that's when we get into actual real frameworks. So things like Nexus, like Less, these are basically actual proper frames, thin frames with core components, and then you can add whatever optional extras you need to it, which again sounds to me easier to use. That's basically Scrum, and that's why a lot of us have had success with Scrum over the years, because it gives us like a minimum feature set that we do with discipline, and it gives us a structure to allow us to experiment and add all the rest in, all the other good ideas later, right? But of course, there's 2 questions here, which is Scrum the right frame to use for scaling? That's an open question, whether you believe that or not. And where do I get the extra bits from? Because famously, Scrum used to have engineering practices 20 plus years ago, and famously, Schwaber dropped them out and then said, "Oh, you just use like extreme programming or something, probably." And people didn't. The idea was you're supposed to discover for yourself that good engineering is important, but lots of people didn't, and so there's a danger there where, again, misuse. So what else? So here's the problem, right? Nature abhors a vacuum. So when you leave a gap, people fill those gaps. They'll fill it with ideas. And so then we get into the world of toolboxes and cookbooks. So this is another different style of scaling method, which is the unfixed stuff from Jürgen Apollo, or it's even RUP, which is the parent of SAFe. These are basically actual proper toolboxes you're supposed to take from and use. That's what you're supposed to do. Take this bit, not that bit, right? Now, toolboxes often get turned into cookbooks where you follow them like a recipe, and that's when they go a bit wrong, toolboxes. And again, I'm worried about guru thinking. I'm worried about if you, like RUP famously back in the 90s was so complex as a methodology set, you would have to hire consultants to configure it for you. That's great if you're a RUP methodologist, but again, for civilians to use it, it's quite hard. And then you get outsiders who don't fully understand your context, making decisions about your context, which again, as a coach, who knows like 101 incorrect. And as there we go. Stella Adler said from the actors workshop, the talent is in the choices. The talent is in the choices, right? So we're back to this again, you know. So how do we deal with this issue? Because my worry was I've just described it to you. If you're recipe led, you believe there are practices that apply everywhere, right? If you're principle led, you believe there are almost no universal practices. Framework led's kind of in the middle. There's a few practices that should be universal, but some of them aren't. And basically imposing principles is just thought crime. And so what are we going to do about this? Well, luckily, many years ago, I invented a technique for this. Now, some of you are going to love this. Rickard especially, he's been waiting for this moment because I get to mention the world famous Nigel scale again. So, of course, you're all equally as famous and aware of the Nigel scale, as famous as Scrum, as famous as extreme programming, as famous as Crystal. Yes, okay, right. This does have some cachet in the industry, the Nigel scale. This was a scale I invented. It's got to be 15 years ago, right? I invented it as a joke, because we were having a discussion in the Scrum Alliance about what is Scrum and what isn't Scrum. And because there was no Scrum guide at the time. And so we just had books that were published like 4 years apart, and each book said something different. And so people like Schwaber and Sutherland wouldn't really helping the situation. And so I came up with this quick model as a joke to try and explain the difference, and it works. As Ben says, he uses it with real people. Nigel scale 1, there is stuff that is core, stuff that we call Scrum. But when we say Scrum, what it's really trying to be is core practice. There is practice that if you bend that, everything breaks in your situation. So the example I've used forever is surgery. If I had surgery on my eye a few months ago, 2 months ago, on my eye, full big operation on my eye. If the surgeon approached me and said, "Hey, Nigel, I'm your surgeon today. I won't be disinfecting my hands for the operation because I don't believe in bacteria or viruses. They don't exist. They're invented by big pharma. So I don't need to wash my hands because there's no such thing as an infection." I can say, "No, shut up. Shut up. No, shut up. Like, wash your bloody hands." Like, you don't, like, you can have your own opinions, okay? But you can't have your own facts. So, like, the idea that bacteria doesn't exist is like, that is not a legitimate opinion to hold. You cannot have that opinion. We're not going to build the world for you, Mr. No Bacteria, right? We're going to disinfect our hands before every operation. And there are practices like that in the world of product development. As you get bigger, that set of practices gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Most of what we do is the world famous Nigel Scale 2, stuff that Scrum doesn't officially care about, the grey area of good practice. Practices that are good in my context, may be good in your context, may be good in your context. So this is where you have to experiment, you have to coach organizations, use your prior experience to self-organize answers to your own complex problems. And finally, Nigel Scale 3, which I'm sure you've already guessed, There is stuff we don't do. Bad ideas, like anti-patterns. Remember, like a bad idea is this, right? Hitting yourself in the head with a hammer is a bad idea, right? Don't do that. Promise me now you won't do that. Promise? Promise? Tony can't promise. Please promise. So, but an anti-pattern is slightly different. An anti-pattern is something that looks like a good idea, but turns out to be a bad idea, right? So let's say you're an alcoholic, right? You have a drinking problem, and it's causing lots of pain to you and your family and your life and causing indigestion problems. As an alcoholic, you may say, okay, that whiskey is really damaging me. So what I'll do is I'll get white wine, mix it with lemonade to make a spritzer. So it goes down much easily and doesn't damage my stomach. Sounds like a good idea, huh? It takes away the damage of the whiskey. Surely it's a good idea, yeah? Well, no, it's a really bad idea. It's enabling your vice even worse. It's making your illness worse. And so that's like an anti-pattern where it looks like a good idea, but actually collapses into a worse situation. And generally, I don't think anyone has really run that type of lens on any of the models out there and really realized in these models which bits are actually fundamental and which bits are good in certain contexts and which bits are bad ideas in certain contexts. And that's a danger for all of us. Okay, so basically it's this. It's kind of like knowing when to have discipline and vigor, like knowing when to stick with something, knowing when to be open-minded and flexible, and not confusing the two. Or generally, as I say here, confusing a good practice with a core practice is probably a bad practice. Hey, that's optional. That probably isn't optional, So if I had to ask you now, in scaling, what would you regard as core practices in scaling? In making big projects work? Type them in the chat box now. Again, don't be frightened. This is all just opinions. It's all just feelings. No one's going to record this and send it to your boss. What do you think this should be? The release bus. What do you think would be a core practice? Something that we've all got to do in everything. This is not a trick question, because I can imagine some practices I think are core. Like communication between teams. Well, I would just say communication in teams, like cross-functionality in a team, I think would be important. If you don't have cross-functionality, how can anyone deliver anything? It's going to fall apart completely. Anyway, I digress, because what we're getting into and what I discovered years after inventing the Nigel scale is there's a far better way of looking at it called Cynefin. Again, if you haven't seen Cynefin before, now is not a complexity workshop to teach you Cynefin. This is 3 days on its own. But the idea of complexity science teaches us that probably in the area we live with organizational design and organizational structures is almost certainly in the complicated complex space, perhaps leaning more into complex, which requires a different approach than just following recipes. It requires a little bit of an analysis and studying and knowing the right thing, but it also requires experimentation. Okay? Because if you're going to be really agile, as we know, some parts of our organization shouldn't be agile. There's types of work in your business where they follow recipes, they follow best practice, they mustn't vary it. It's got variation is deviation and deviation is defect. They've got to do it the same way each time. And so a genuine agile organization would have pockets of non-agility, and that shows their agility, if that makes sense. It shows their adaptability, because those areas need not to be adaptable. And this was my other worry, which is, what the hell do we teach? Because I just taught you all that, but no civilian cares. Like, you're all coaches, you're all professionals. This is your industry. This is your space. But imagine teaching that in a bloody course, like for 2 hours or something. Who cares? And so what do we teach? Do we teach the controversy? Do we teach the there's different ways? Do we pick a side and say, hey, frameworks are God, frameworks are evil? Do we pick practices to teach? Because here's the problem. If we pick a practice, but as an SME group, if we pick, let's say, release trains as a core practice that everyone should learn in the scaling course, what does that sound like we are inferring people should be doing? Safe? If I said, like, there is only one product owner per product, that's it. They're called product owners, one of them per product. That's a key fundamental practice that we all should teach. There is only one product owner per product, right? What am I accidentally inferring? Scrum, but it could be Nexus or less, you know. And so, like the quote here, famous quote from the world of journalists: if someone says it's raining and another person says it's dry, it's not your job to quote them both. Your job is to look out the window and find out what's true. And here's another problem, which the Scrum Alliance is a broad church. Where I've joked before, but if the Scrum Alliance was a cult, it would be the worst cult on earth, because everyone's got a different opinion about everything. There's no sort of like, you know, dogma that people follow. Everyone's got their own opinions and their own things, right? And so we need to have an approach that not only caters for the wide context of the world, but caters for the wide context of our guide community who teach this. Because some people have very different opinions on this stuff to others. And that's probably correct in the type of complex work we're doing. So, where are we going to go with the answer? Well, oh, there's one more thing, by the way, just to point this out. Nearly every scaling method isn't. I think pretty much every scaling method out in the industry is actually a scaled method. So it's scaled. It's big. It's not scaling. It's not growing. It's not evolving. It's fixed and big. And that worries me as well, because it's kind of saying this is where you're going to. Well, what if I don't want to go there? Well, I may go on a different journey as I evolve and scale and grow. And so my other big issue was we need to discuss those three things in terms of any scaling course. The introduction of the method, it can't just be, ta-da, big method. How do we introduce it? How do we utilize it? And how do we evolve these methods? Because, again, bombshell, good practices evolve over time. Have you noticed how everyone's hating on story points at the moment? You've ever noticed that? Everyone's hating on story points. It's cool to hate story points at the moment. Yet 10 years ago, story points were like, the in thing, right? And people are thinking, we've learnt more. Yes, you have. That's the entire point of good practices. People learn more, they discover more, they find better ways of working. But that happens in teams, not just in like people who invent methods. Like, as for me, I've seen teams go on a journey of estimation through a range of different estimating techniques as they evolve their approach, as they learn more about their work. And so any scaling method has to appreciate that the method itself will be changing as it evolves and moves along. So basically, that's a lot of pain. Plus, there's also descaling, which is some people believe we just need to get rid of process rather than add process. So there's an entire descaling conversation we need to have. Sometimes we need to embrace simplicity, remove the process not done rather than add more process. And that's going to be a horrible political conversation to have on social media. I was trying to pitch this on social media, the type of tomatoes that could get thrown at you, right? And the final... We've got to be agile with this, basically, is what I was saying, because we're going to learn and have to pivot a lot as we're doing this. And finally, we're trying to look to the future, not the past. What we don't want to do is recreate what already exists. As Wayne Gretzky said, I skate to where the puck is going, not where it's been. So we need to be ahead. Every method out there so far at the moment is the past. So we need to be looking to the future a bit. Otherwise, you could end up inventing the Zune. Remember the Zune? The Microsoft Zune? Do you remember that? I bet some of you had a Zune, didn't you? I bet some of you did. Don't admit it. That'd be the worst thing to admit. But, you know, great, but it's just too late. It's like, hey, we've almost built the iPod. Almost. Bit late. So what have I got left? 10 minutes left? Let's look at the actual scaling product we came up with. Okay, let's look at what these are all things that fed into the product. Let's look at what we came up with, right? So first things first, what did we aim at? We aimed it here in the middle. Big product agile. That's where it's aimed. Business agility is a big conversation. That isn't scaling yet. That's making HR get your own house in order first, right? Who's it aimed at? When we started developing it, we thought it was really going to be aimed at like high-end people, such as yourself, coaches, executives, consultants, right? But actually, and we'll talk about this in a minute with the third major part of this course, it's going to have to be a lot of people learning this. There's no point in having a small guru community knowing this stuff. It's going to have to be, everyone's going to have to know this stuff, because only if you all know this stuff can you make appropriate changes at the appropriate levels at the appropriate times. Can people comment appropriate on this? We need to get away from basically a kind of priesthood of knowledge. You know, and again, as coaches, you know this. Knowledge in here is worthless to your clients. You know, knowledge out there in your client is essential. So how are you building up that capability in them? Okay. What does the course look like itself? It's 3 parts. So the first part is basically pretty much what I talked to you about then. The philosophy, the mindset, how to think about scaling in a different way. That's the first part of the course, right? The second part of the course is patterns. So using recognized patterns to overcome challenges in scale. So these frameworks are great. Let's draw upon them, but let's not just copy them and clone them slavishly. Let's take the bits that are good for you and leave behind the bits that are not. Right? Especially for things like unfixed and safe. That's literally what they're designed for. It could be the same truth with things like less and nexus, or at least that's an open conversation to have, but draw upon patterns. And the third part, and what I regard as the key part, is changing. I don't think enough agile people talk about change agency enough. They talk about change enough. They talk about methods and practices, and it's all two-dimensional thinking. The key thing for us is about changing, evolving, learning. That's the key skill set. And so how's the course work? Well, God, there's loads of jargon in it. We had to define jargon in the end because everyone uses different words to mean different things. So we literally, poor old Simon, who's on this call somewhere, Simon had to dug up some references of actual, didn't you, Simon, in dictionaries and everything, of like, what does this word actually mean? And we had to come up with a couple of terms ourselves, purely because no one out in the industry seemed to have defined that term yet. The joke was, you all knew it, but no one had written it down. And so we had to come up with some language to capture words that haven't been written down. And the main idea behind the course is patterns. Now, again, this is not a session to talk about patterns, but if you know about Christopher Alexander's work in patterns from civil engineering and city design, this idea of patterns is problems that happen over and over again in our environment and describe possible solutions to those problems. And the idea of a pattern is you never do it the same way twice, but it can be applied in lots of different situations. For me, a lot of the frameworks we use, a lot of the methodologies available out there are pattern libraries. They are libraries full of patterns we can draw upon. We just need to know to do that and draw upon them appropriately. Now, if you're lucky, there's like the one pattern book for the architect people, but in terms of our world, there's not enough libraries out there. So there is famously Cope and Sutherland's Scrum Plot library. Here it is. If you haven't bought this book, by the way, buy that book. Jesus, buy that book. It's a range of patterns that you can use in Scrum, but there's also conversation around building pattern libraries in the Scrum Alliance outside it and using the current people like Less, Safe, all these other people else, use all of them as sources of these patterns that you can draw upon depending on your own personal choices. Because it comes to this. Someone said it earlier on in the chat. Scaling is not one size fits all. That includes for guides as well as for civilians, for people teaching like yourselves, not just for the people utilizing the methods. So I made this joke the other day. I think it's a good place to mention it. So SAFE. SAFE stands for the Scaled Agile Framework. Okay? Can anyone see any problem with that acronym? Scaled? Yeah. Should be scaling, shouldn't it, really? Probably not a framework. That's harsh to say it's not agile. But what about the bloody E? Technically, the acronym SAF. SAF. So why don't we use the E for something? So I made this joke in a client and it really stuck. Have you ever heard in English the magic E? Ever heard the magic E in English? The magic E. But it used to be a song on TV. Magic E, magic E. But the point of the magic E is it changed the meanings of a word in English. So bit becomes bite, rob becomes robe, cub becomes cube. You know, the E, you don't say the E, but it transforms the letters and the vowels ahead of it. So SAF, the agile, you can transform it with the E if the E means experiment, if the E means emergence, if the E means evolution. Okay? If you think of it like that, then also you're taking on this knowledge base and you're evolving and learning and expand it. Yeah. You can take from it and use it and draw from it because it's a great source for loads of ideas. But would I do it? No, hell no. But it's our source, not the source. Right. And that's the other important one. There's lots of flavors out there that you can draw from and learn from. Because remember, to wrap this all up, 70% of change programs fail. Right? They fail not because of the thing you're doing, but because of the change process. I do not give a flying fillip if you're agile, digital, outsourcing, insourcing, cloud, AI is the new one. Hey, we're undergoing an AI transformation. Can you help us with that, Nigel? How much is it paying? £2,000 a day. Yes, I can. Because the problem isn't the thing, it's the transformation part. The changing part is the problem. Now, famously, that statistic was made up back in about 2000. Literally, the number was made up, but it turns out to be true, which is the best thing about made up metrics. Somehow they come true because scaling is changing. And so that workshop that we've built to put out in the world, a third of it is about change, because that's where people get stuck. It doesn't matter whether you call someone a release train engineer or scrum master or any bloody... That's important to us. It's important in the long term. But if the change process is we're going to stick everyone on a webinar for 2 days and then they're going to go off and do it, it doesn't matter what you teach them. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. And so what really upset me about that report that came out was there was talk about commoditization and said, hey, coaches have got to be careful. Yes, coaches have got to be careful. If you're going in with post-it notes and flim-flam, and that's not enough, right? That isn't enough anymore. But they need you more than ever. Because what they need is clever people helping other clever people find ways of working and finding approaches to help them evolve. So the final two pieces of this, that one of the things we talk about in that course is scaffolding. This is an interesting idea. I first learned about it from Knevin, but it turns out it's been in educational design for decades. The idea of think of scaffolding as impermanent structures to help you evolve and emerge. So some of the like story points you mentioned earlier on, story points, bad or good, you're wrong. It's a scaffold. It could be a scaffold to get you from one world to another world. Release trains, big room planning. Greg, do you remember big room, getting everyone into a release room? Oh, the money, the flight costs, right? But it's a good idea to get people together at the start, but not keep doing it forever. You know, it's a scaffold. It's something you emerge and you evolve away from. You go, hey, that was great to get the people together. Now we've built the relationships. We don't have to have that big meeting every 12 weeks, you know? And so this is a really important idea. There's loads of different types of scaffolding out there. Stitches are scaffolding. Scaffolding is scaffolding. These are all things to help you understand that there'll be semi-permanent ideas that live and die in your organization to help the growth, to help the evolution. So what's my conclusion on top of all this? I have no idea. I like the Phantom Menace. So I'm always very nervous about giving advice in any absolutes. You know, only the Sith deal in absolutes. But yeah, like, because I like Phantom Menace, a lot of people hate it. So Simon, I can't remember which one of us wrote that on the right-hand side, but some of us wrote this as a definition of what we're doing. An approach to scaling that focuses on using the situational context to determine how scaling is applied, starting with an understanding of patterns of problems in a given context and applying common, well-known solutions that have been proven to work well in the given context. Nice. I put this quote, I wrote this up here. A large volunteer force, experimenting in a safe-to-fail way, evolving constantly, changing with scaffolds, drawing on recognized patterns, but thoughtfully and contextually, with a strong conceptual background of the theory and the playing field of agility, creating a large-scale world for great things to happen to good people and for good people. Or another way to look at it is, by the end of the 2 days, they'll have patterns to try, tools to change, and tools to help the try and the change, an understanding of the world. Because that's what it's all about. And the reason I'm telling you this is not to get you coming on the course. The course isn't aimed at people like you, really. It's aimed at like everyone else in the organization. But the idea is to understand that we need new ways of thinking and doing business. We need to get these ideas more into the industry and not sit back and accept the commoditization of big frames that you buy, big tools that you buy, and then same status quo responses happening again and again and again. Now, there is talk of a sequel. So there has been talk of a sequel course. I don't know if Thingy's on here. Is she on here? I can't see if Carol's on here. Carol was on here earlier on. Anyway. There's no sequel course under development just yet, but I would love to know, as coaches, what would interest you in a sequel. because the Scrum Alliance is thinking about building the next level up, and that would be aimed at people like you attending. And I'd love to know what sort of things you would love to know, because that would be interesting as well. Because one of the key things to all this stuff is market research. So I'd leave you with that thought. So if you have any ideas or any bugbears or anything at all just about where the future of this all is going, I would love to hear from you. I would really love to hear from you. Okay. But apart from that, Ben made me swear I would fit this into an hour. Ben, have I fitted it into an hour?
Miraculously, yes.
Miraculously,
But we've got some
yes.
time for questions, haven't we?
There
We've
we
got
go.
some time for that, which is good. We wanted a bit of time for people to raise anything on their mind about.
There we go.
news.
So now, bearing in mind that is a massive brain dump, but what would you like to talk about in terms of the big topic of scaling?
Why did it take so long to get around to doing something? Because, you know, I work for a large organization. We needed the scaling framework years ago. So we effectively built our own, but we borrowed from a lot of other places. And that's kind of where I think a lot of stuff works, is if you pragmatically borrow from where you are. So I'm just interested in why it took so long for the, you know, to
well, I can say, because the Scrum Alliance, there's 4 things in there. One, they tried to have partnership relationships with other organizations to do that part. Secondly, there has always been a bit of a belief in the Scrum Alliance that Scrum is fractal, that Scrum is self-scaling, that you don't need to add anything else to it, that you can purely take Scrum and just build it up without any other support systems, which intellectually you can. But it's very, very difficult. And so that's been, I think, where a gap was missed in terms of the alliance.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree with that, because the kinds of things that we need to address as a large organization, quite a lot of the frameworks that grow organically to scale don't address.
No, because they grow organically, but it grows organically like a bramble. So it's organic, but it's wrapped around your trees, it's wrapped around your hand, it's not wrapped in the way you want it to. And that's why it's sort of even, like I always joke, but like we talk about evolution, like growing, but like brambles grow, you know, so it's growing. We talk these gardening metaphors, but there's the downside of gardening as well, which is weeds. And so it's being aware of what we should cut and what we shouldn't. But again, I don't think till recently the entire agile space has been really super aware of that, because this has all been so cutting edge. Remember, a lot of when I was doing Scrum, it was like 18 months before, like previously to that, the Scrum was still stuck in like easel somewhere. And so a lot of what we've been doing in the agile industry is basically building a plane as the plane takes off. In terms of practices, we haven't had the time to build up a reservoir of knowledge or a knowledge base, basically, of understanding what works and what doesn't. And I think we're finally getting there, and now we can start drawing upon it a bit. That's my personal opinion.
Okay, thank you.
Nigel, I had a question in terms of, have you looked at disciplined agile? I mean,
yes, Scott Ambler's stuff. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I got disappointed when you know, the PMI bought them, because I think it will happen. But the thing that I do like about it and most is that, and it's the first thing that they teach you, is that context counts, which is how you opened, and I totally agree with that. And I think that's why I found it quite useful in terms of implementing scaling, where somebody says we don't like safe and we don't like some other things, we want something else. In terms of what Scrum Alliance is doing, obviously, what were your thoughts of DA? Did you take anything from it? Any value in your opinion?
So there's things I would say that I don't want to say on a recorded call. I've never totally appreciated Scott Ambler's work. So I'll say that. For a variety of reasons.
Let me simplify for you. Are you net positive or net negative?
So I used to be very net negative. I used to be 100% negative, right? But it has evolved. It has evolved. So these days, I would put it in the same camp in my head as something like safe, where I think there is lots of good in it that you can draw upon, but lots of bear traps in it as well
Oh,
if you're not
100%.
careful. So,
Yeah.
and it's just, have you got the skill to dodge the bear traps is the main issue. Because that's my concern with all these techniques, is that when you're of high ability, everything seems simple. But when people have less ability, it can get quite difficult. And if we introduce techniques that require lots of very careful, nuanced thinking, it's very hard for an organization to get that. And no, not anyone's stupid. No one's stupid. Just lack of like that level. And so I get concerned with those tools, and how they can be misused more than used. Because I'm trying to protect the people, really. So, but I would draw upon it. But would I? I wouldn't like to. Yeah, like people like us go on the course, learn it, and take what you do, but
Exactly.
don't let it near civilians. Is probably what I'd say.
Yeah, I like that. Not near civilians.
Yeah, yeah.
I've got a question, Nigel. It's probably going to contain a few sweeping statements, so apology if I offend anyone along the way. So when I think about when they launched the CAL, the Certified Agile Leadership, the intent was good, that it's for the leaders of the organization to help grow and evolve. In reality, what happened was a whole heap of Agile coaches like us went on there, and very few people from the organizations actually ended up doing that course. Now, there's a trap that we could fall into the exact same thing here. So how are we targeting and messaging at this at the actual people within the organization? And is there going to be real pragmatic stuff that they can then take from this and apply for themselves? Because again, sweeping statement, you've basically just said it's evolution. There's lots of different practices. Look at everything, use them all. But in reality, Agile coaches or consultants are the ones that are going to be able to piece it all together, have the right authority within the organization to be able to get this stuff working end to end, because Bob in the Scrum team isn't necessarily going to have the empowerment to be able to do that. So how do we stop ourselves from falling into these traps and make something that's really pragmatic, actionable, that organizations can take and then drive forward themselves?
Yeah.
Sorry for the long question.
No, but it's good. It's a good question. So there's multifaceted ways to approach that built into the course. So, for instance, learning objectives is a very nerdy thing to talk about, but there's some very deliberately designed learning objectives, not only just to talk in theory, but in practice, to meet people where they are. So the people where they are come out with real things they can do today, right? So someone can come out and I got things I can do today in my job without power to make my life better. Right. I think we call them logistical challenges. Right. But then the other side is there's stuff about change that people need to know. Right. Which is that there's in terms of change process and how change works. And some of that is the stuff, like you said, about involving leadership. Okay. Now we can all pray, because everyone says to me since the start of time, I wish my boss would come on this course, whatever course I'm teaching. Right. The amount of bosses I've had on that course is less than 1 or 2%. Right. Because they don't want to spend 2 days with Nigel. They don't understand. But the point is that how you get change happening is by getting to someone who knows someone and they know someone. And that's a lot of what good organizational change is about, which is what an entire third of the course is. So it's not just giving them ways to scale, it's giving them ways to get scaling working in their organization. So they leave with tools and they can see the gaps and go, okay, I can't do this, but I can see where the problem is. And now we can work on that problem. So that's the idea behind it. It's not just giving them an approach, it's giving them ways to build an approach and ways to them to actually get that approach working, actually being sticky in an organization. And that's why the range of the audience is quite wide. So I've done this course internally without certification in a company, and it went really well because everyone had common themes and common areas. Some of our colleagues on the SME board have done it publicly, like for a range of strangers, and they had more issues with a range of strangers because they didn't have any common context. So I see this type of workshop working best as an in-house workshop with multiple people in the same organization, and then you're building up a core competency anyway in that area. So you're not training one person and sending them back, because the famous line about change, isn't it, which is remember pickles are cucumbers, aren't they? Remember, the cucumber gets pickled far quicker than the vinegar gets cucumbered. It's like when you have one change agent go in, you get destroyed by the organization. They don't change the organization. And so one of the key concepts in change is building up an army of change agents. And by doing it as an in-house product, I believe that's where it would have most success. But the range, I think the range needs to be wide, because I think a lot of times change is a big end-to-end experience, and having leaders involved is just not enough. It's just not enough.
And I've got an add-on question, if I may, in that actually when you go into work with an organization, there's certain things that you have to have in place, like there has to be some form of planning or finance or way of reconciling that. So when you talked about there's going to be some patterns that you're going to talk about specifically in the class, is this class going to hit some of those big ones, which are the fundamentals that are going to help them to kind of, I call them table stakes, get those things right, and everything else can evolve around it. So is it going to be like talk about these things, or is it down to every single trainer to come up with whatever they want?
At the moment, it's trainer specific at the moment. Purely because there's so many things you could talk about. There is a feedback loop in place. If there are certain things that come up for everyone, there is the idea of making them into formal learning objectives, if I remember correctly, Simon, from ages ago. But the trouble is for one organization that will be critical, and for an organization it won't be. So my aim with this is I'm not going in with pre-built patterns to teach. I'm going in with pre-built sources of patterns, and then we can pull out the stuff that's dependent on them and dependent on their conversations that they want to have. So if they want to keep it quite logistical, and quite how do I get 5 teams working together, we can. And if they want to deep dive into some particular area, they can. But that's the sort of stuff also in terms of enterprise agility, I think starts coming in. Like, how do you fund an enterprise agile organization? How do you do HR where there's no individual performance reviews anymore, which for this course is out of scope. But it's definitely somewhere, someone needs to cover it somewhere. Who was next? It was Patrick.
Oh yeah, well, literally thing is, I was following from Helen's point of view. Agile transformations I've done, they've not succeeded unless you have finance, HR, and the PMO on board. And in terms of any kind of scaling, you want to be introducing, if you're doing any kind of scaling, especially if you've got any route of period, well, basically, anything less, you want maybe quarterly financial planning and the ability to actually redirect allocated funds for projects. Because otherwise, finance and project codes and all that kind of stuff, that structure is a limiting factor within an organization. And HR and stuff, if you ever have to deal with any kind of organization have unions and changing people's ways of working and job descriptions, if you ever have to deal with something called Tupe, oh my God, right? It's those are the things those are kind of like barriers to say, like, well, of why we can't be agile, why we can't scale. So in terms of if you're going to go in and any kind of scaling framework, you mentioned that maybe you don't go into depth with HR. I think I've been in one place where the agile transformation was owned by HR, which was an incredibly good idea. So
yeah. And so again, I can talk about what I will do and what I do, but in terms of the design of the course, the third is on change, which is everything you're describing here, which is like, how do you build a guiding coalition? Who should be in that coalition? Who are the leaders who can lead this thing? It's all so if you've ever done John Cotter, I'm doing Cotter stuff now. Cotter stuff is a bit old, but I still like it. That's what I'm teaching for that particular learning objective. But there is learning objectives to bring up that stuff, to bring up that conversation. What we don't want to do, and this is the danger, is go in with like, and this is how you solve it. Because then you're trying to impose, like just the other day, I'm working with a large client. They're talking about changing people's job roles. And the Americans in the room are like, well, we'll change their job roles. And then there are Germans in that room. You can't change job roles unless you go through the union. It's a workers' council you have to go through. And so for one person, it was words. Yeah, it was like that. It was seconds. And the others, it was like, boom. And because they didn't realize. And that's why, again, I don't want to get too much into doing change agency here, but it's why I was a huge proponent, I think Simon was as well, about a huge aspect of this being about change agency, because that is one of the key things in place. But you can't teach how to change an agile organization. That is literally, that would be the recipe book of recipe books, and it would be wrong. And so what we've got to do is give them tools in that space to then help them make their way and make their own personal choices in that space. So again, it's where we've got to be careful. So as part of this material, there is learning on that. I would suggest it isn't sufficient, but then nothing would be, because the real work is out in the organization. But first, to fix a problem, you have to make people aware there is a problem. And that's what a lot of training's about. Training's not replacing coaching. Training is giving people awareness of issues, and then coaches can help deal with them on a day-to-day. Geetha.
And I really enjoyed this, by the way. My question was around you mentioning the change agents and the change agency. Having been curious about change management and becoming a registered change management practitioner way back in 2014 or whatever, and I've been trying to piece it together and connect the two and seeing, like, how did traditional change management start, and what pieces of that do we take and apply into our agile ways of working and thinking and everything. Do you have any views? Have you also explored change management as it was practiced in the 1970s and now, and how do you fit it in?
Yeah. I'm a huge fan. There's a range of work out there that I particularly like. I said before, John Cotter's work I've always liked. Again, some people don't, but I do. His work, Iceberg is Melting, which is a bit naff, and Range, Accelerate was one of his last books, which has been heavily influenced by Agile, by the way, that book has. The classic one is this one. If you want the classic of classics, it's this lad. Here we go. Put his earphones out. That's the classic of classics, Change Agents Handbook. That's 80s. That's about quality assurance change agency, but it's well worth a read if you haven't read it. Again, a third of it is like I think this is the page I've got marked with the quote. No, it isn't the marked page, but in here they're talking about change in the office, and one of the big changes is, do we stop smoking in the office? That's how old the book is. So, should smoking be banned in the office? So there's some stuff that's completely outdated in it, but there's lots of it that rings true to this very day. And I like it as a book. It's a very interesting book. And I think when you start reading these books, you'll see how some of them have heavily influenced the readers who then came up with agile ideas. So there's a huge dose of this sort of stuff in Scrum Mastery, for instance. Change agency. Rex.
Yeah. One of the points you sort of mentioned at the beginning was talking about rather than large organizations, large products. And in general, I see large organizations going for scale because they're large and not because they've got a big product. So you then see them implementing something like SAFe for a whole bunch of disparate things, and everybody's sitting in release plans for how are you going to deal with these people, let them down when they turn up for the first day. By the second day, the sort of director of big organization, not big, is going to lynch you.
Well, but again, there is still things they need to do, but they need to appreciate. So I didn't come up with, this is a lie, but a colleague of ours back at BT, Kerry Buckley, I don't know if Greg remembers the name Kerry Buckley, but Kerry, I heard him say something once where he was discussing with someone about Agile, and they kind of said, hey, Kerry, you want BT to be like a gazelle when it's an elephant. What we need is a faster moving elephant. And what Kerry said was, no, what we need is a herd of gazelle. And that really, really stuck with me as an idea, because that's what lots looks like. So they're all independent, but they're all kind of next to each other and flowing together. There are tools and techniques for that, but they're very different tools and techniques to what we would describe as ways to get lots of people working together. Like, for instance, the classic one you described, Rex, is lots of independent teams having big room planning pointlessly together.
Yeah.
Like, my stuff doesn't touch your stuff at all. We're just in the same room existing. There's no point us being together. That's an anti-pattern in that situation. It's actually it's something that is worse than what they were currently doing. And so with this type of workshop, because it's so context sensitive to the people who are there, the workshop will take it, because it's not like you must do this material. The workshop adjusts to who's in the room, which is what works about it. But that is a problem out in the industry, which is people applying alignment processes where what they need is independent processes.
Yeah. A lot of the time, I think sometimes they need to start actually doing some agile practices and get that right before they, it's like, let's go running because we haven't started walking yet. Yeah, that's fine.
But this is the advice I gave the safe people this week, which was is what Martin Fowler said. Martin Fowler said the last thing you should do with agile methods is scale. Right, and what he was saying was don't scale agile methods. What he was saying, right? But an ex-colleague of ours, I'm doing so many BT references. They're all for Greg, who's here, right? Greg, do you remember Roger Leeton? Greg, remember Roger Leeton? Roger, he said, no, you misunderstand what Martin meant. He says the last thing you should do with agile methods is scale. So you do them well first, and then you scale. Clever, isn't it? That isn't what Martin Fowler meant. That isn't what he meant. But it's true. Yeah. It actually is true. If you scale bad, you get worse.
Yeah.
So what you need to do is get the teams themselves working semi-competently together. Trouble is they can't be super competent because they're in an end-to-end chain, but semi-competent together, and then you can start talking about the bigger conversation pieces. So, for instance, in one of the simulations I'm doing on that course, or will do on that course, is about I have some scaling patterns that you may regard as non-scaling patterns, but cross-functionality is a scaling pattern. Because I bet a lot of you here have like 5 teams building 5 subsystems that have to plug together, and it's just chaos. And what you probably need to do is have a cross-functional feature team down the entire slice that could do it end to end. But hey, but that's the type of thing. So
yeah.
Thanks very much for those questions, everyone. I'm going to close down there. I just have one last question for Nigel. Nigel, obviously, this is a very new product, new course. What is the best way to find out more about this, or when you've got something available?
Yeah, so
or whatever else is going on in your world?
I've not even. I've basically I've written the course along with Simon. I don't think either of us are qualified to teach it yet. You've got to fill in all the paperwork because I'm still doing the paperwork. I've run the course but non-certified. So if people want a non-certified version, I can do that from tomorrow. Sells, but it will be coming out for me. But the aim of this is not to sell it to you. I want to be okay. Yes, you can buy it from me. Yes, it would pay my mortgage, but that's not why I'm here. Right? The reason I'm here is because these ideas need more traction in industry. And I don't care if you get them off this training course. I don't care if you get them off this session, but they need more traction in the industry. If you want to hire me, you can. I'm available. If you just want to call me up for chats, I like talking, as you can tell. You can get me on any of those things. I've got some cheesy YouTube videos. I've got LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter occasionally. You can email me any questions and queries and stuff. But I think this type of thing is going to work best in organizations rather than just like a training course you go on. It will happen if they want to learn more about whatever this is called. You can go to the Scrum Alliance website. There are some available for booking on now. But I think they're all American and Indian time zones, but they are available if you don't want to wait for me. But the point is, I think we as coaches need to be at the cutting edge because Agile's becoming commoditized. So we need to be at the cutting edge. And so let's get to the cutting edge and help actually get organizations better and not just conform to what other people say and do. There we go.